Young married couple, Jason and Sarah, had a dream of renovating an abandoned psychiatric hospital and turning it into a hotel. They were fascinated by the idea of restoring the old building to its former glory and giving it a new purpose. The hospital had been closed for over 20 years and was in a state of disrepair. But Jason and Sarah were undeterred. They saw the potential in the building and were determined to make their dream a reality. They purchased the hospital at a bargain price and began the long and arduous process of renovations. They worked tirelessly, day and night, to restore the building to its former grandeur. As they worked, they learned more about the hospital's dark past. They discovered that it had been a place of great suffering and torment. Many patients had been subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment. Some had even died within its walls. Despite the hospital's unsettling history, Jason and Sarah were unwavering in their resolve. They were determined to create a beautiful and inviting hotel where guests could come to relax and rejuvenate. Finally, after months of hard work, the hotel was ready to open its doors. Jason and Sarah were thrilled. They had accomplished their dream and were eager to welcome their first guests. The hotel's grand opening was a success. Guests were drawn to the hotel's unique history and its elegant Victorian architecture. Jason and Sarah were overjoyed to see their dream come to fruition. The first few weeks of operation were smooth and uneventful. Guests were happy with their accommodations and the service they received. Jason and Sarah were relieved that their hard work was paying off, but then, one day, their first guest arrived. He was a middle-aged man named Mr. Adams. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and sunken eyes. He had a strange, unsettling air about him. Jason and Sarah checked Mr. Adams into his room and showed him around the hotel. He seemed impressed, but he was also strangely withdrawn. He kept to himself and rarely interacted with the other guests. One evening, Jason saw Mr. Adams wandering the hotel corridors late at night. He was wearing a long white nightgown and carrying a candle. His hair was disheveled and his eyes had a wild look in them. Jason approached Mr. Adams and asked if he was okay. Mr. Adams just smiled enigmatically and said, "I'm fine, just taking a stroll." Jason was uneasy, but he didn't want to pry. He excused himself and went back to his office. The next day, Sarah went to check on Mr. Adams. She found his room empty. His bed was unmade, but there was no sign of his luggage. She checked the hotel's security cameras, but she couldn't find any footage of Mr. Adams leaving the building. Sarah was concerned. She told Jason what had happened, and they decided to investigate further. They searched the hotel from top to bottom, but they couldn't find any trace of Mr. Adams. They began to wonder if Mr. Adams had ever been a guest at the hotel in the first place. They checked the hotel's register, but Mr. Adams' name was nowhere to be found. Jason and Sarah were baffled. They didn't know what to think. They started to wonder if the hotel was haunted. That night, Jason and Sarah were working late in the hotel office. They were trying to figure out what had happened to Mr. Adams. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the hallway. They went to investigate, but they found nothing. They returned to the office and continued working. But a few minutes later, they heard the noise again. This time it was louder. Jason and Sarah stood up and slowly walked out into the hallway. They listened carefully, but they couldn't hear anything. Suddenly, they heard a faint voice whispering. It was coming from the end of the hallway. Jason and Sarah cautiously made their way towards the voice. As they got closer, they could hear the words more clearly. "I'm coming," the voice whispered. "I'm coming for you." Jason and Sarah reached the end of the hallway. They stood there, frozen with fear. The voice grew louder. "I'm coming," it whispered. "I'm coming for you." And then Jason and Sarah saw it. It was a figure standing in the darkness. It was tall and thin, with pale skin and sunken eyes. It was wearing a long white nightgown and carrying a candle. The figure smiled at Jason and Sarah. It was the same smile that Mr. Adams had given them. Jason and Sarah screamed and ran. They ran back down the hallway and into the hotel office. They locked the door and huddled together in the corner. They could hear the figure moving around outside the office. It was trying to get in. Jason and Sarah were terrified. They didn't know what to do. Suddenly, the figure stopped moving. There was silence for a moment, and then the figure spoke. "I know you're in there," it said. "You can't hide from me forever." Jason and Sarah exchanged a terrified look. They knew what they had to do. Jason opened the desk drawer and pulled out a gun. He loaded it and handed it to Sarah. Sarah took the gun and pointed it at the door. "Stay back," she said. "I'm warning you." The figure chuckled. "You can't hurt me," it said. "I'm already dead." Jason and Sarah knew that the figure was telling the truth, but they didn't have any other choice. Sarah fired the gun at the door. The bullet slammed into the wood, but the figure didn't flinch. Jason and Sarah fired again and again, but it was no use. The figure was unharmed. The figure laughed again. "It's useless," it said. "You can't hurt me." Jason and Sarah knew that they were trapped. They looked at each other in despair, and then the figure disappeared. Jason and Sarah dropped to the ground, exhausted and relieved. They had survived, but they knew that the danger was not over. The figure would be back, and next time, it would be ready to finish what it had started. Jason and Sarah closed the hotel the next day. They couldn't bear to stay in a place that was haunted by the ghost of Mr. Adams. They never saw the figure again, but they knew that it was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The Moonlight Inn was an old hotel at the edge of a quiet town. It looked a bit old, with vines growing on its walls, and it held stories that people had forgotten. Among all its rooms, room 206 was the one that scared people the most. People said it had a spooky history, with dark stories and faraway cries. They even said the bravest folks didn't dare go inside. This room's tale became a well-known story in the town. People said they heard strange things like ghostly shapes, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone, and crying sounds. When guests came to the hotel, they would avoid that room. They'd look at it with curious eyes and talk about it in quiet voices, confirming its scary reputation. The hotel's owner had put a danger sign outside its door and sealed it. He would usually avoid putting anyone at the entire 200 floor, but on busy days, he would open it up except for room number 206. One busy day when the hotel had a big sports team to house, all the rooms were occupied, and the 200 floor had to be kept open for the guests, but room number 206 was kept sealed. The players spent a lot of time at the hotel and rested a lot. At night after a party, one of the players, Bill, went to his room to get some new clothes when he saw his friend walk to another room. He got curious because he knew that his friend Mike was also his roommate, so where was he headed to? Mike walked into the room 206. Despite of the danger sign, he opened the door and entered the room. Bill followed him into the room, but strangely, the room was empty. Bill looked around, but Mike was nowhere to be found. That's when he heard Mike calling him, "Come here, Bill, I'm in the balcony." Bill followed the voice, but the balcony was empty. He looked around, but no use. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him as he turned around to see it was Mike, but he looked different. His eyes were hollow, and even the white of the eyes was black. Bill got scared and panicked, but it was too late. Mike had pushed him from the balcony. The next morning, Bill was found by the gardener, his eyes hollow and his skull cracked open. The entire team got scared, and there was chaos everywhere. The captain of the team decided to shift to another hotel, and the entire inn was shut down and sealed. The same night, when the hotel owner was all alone in his office, he felt a light knock on his door. He opened the door to see it was a woman. She looked like she was in her 20s, but she looked very pale and her eyes looked lifeless. She asked the owner for a room to spend the night. The owner told her that the hotel was sealed, but she kept on standing there. She asked the key for room 206 and said that she was born there. The owner didn't know what to do and warned her about the room. She kept on saying, "I was born there." Left with no choice, the owner handed her the keys and she walked out the office. The owner decided to follow her to make sure she is safe. The woman took the elevator, and as soon as she got on the floor 200, she walked straight to the room 206. She opened the door, and the door closed on its own, as if it was waiting for the woman. The owner went back, but he was anxious and worried about the woman. After a while, he started to hear a scratching sound coming from the room. He went up to check, and the door was slightly opened. He saw the woman trying to scratch the concrete wall with a metal rod. Paint was chipping off. The owner went in and asked her what she was doing, and she said that she is trapped in the wall. The owner thought that the woman is crazy, but she kept on repeating. That's when they heard a baby crying through the walls. The owner went back and took a hammer from the supplies ROM. He started to hammer the wall. The wall slowly broke down. Inside, they saw something wrapped in a cloth. The woman took it out, and it was the skeleton of an infant. The room started to shake and started falling down. They quickly got out of the room and out of the inn. The woman told him that her mother gave birth to her in that room. She was not mentally stable and did not want a kid, so she spent an entire night cementing her kid in the wall, and later on, she closed the wall. The manager felt saddened by the woman's story and understood why the room had been haunting everyone. He took the skeleton and gently buried it in the backyard. When he was done burying, he could see a smile on the woman's face as she slowly faded away.